Imagine standing in a dark hall, the air heavy with smoke and salt, and hearing the sound of iron cauldrons bubbling with molten metal. That wasn't for war, or forging blades. It was for the women. At Repton in 986, archaeologists found them in rows, 236 of them, mouth stained black, teeth coated with mercury. They had drunk it willingly. Mothers, daughters, sisters. Women who had once held keys at their belts as symbols of authority, keepers of estates, wives of the men who went raiding. Their men had fallen on English fields, and the women understood what waited next. So they lifted clay cups to their lips and swallowed agony, convulsing until their bones cracked under the violence. They chose that death because the alternative was worse. Stop here for a moment. Ask yourself, what makes a woman prefer her children foaming at the mouth to living another day? This isn't the Viking saga sung in mead halls. This isn't the tale of brave longships or northern gods. This is the truth buried under layers of myth and blood. The Vikings built an empire not just with steel and fire, but with something colder, something systematic, the breaking of women. They perfected it. They made it law, they made it commerce, they made it a machine that stretched from Dublin to Hedeby, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Their enemies' wives weren't trophies. They were merchandise, living coin, converted into silver bars that built kingdoms. Archaeologists uncovered it in the records, in the architecture, in the ground itself. Purpose-built slave warehouses. Drainage channels carved into stone floors to carry away filth. Iron rings bolted to walls at measured intervals, shackles sized for men, for women, for children. And when I say children, I mean wrists no larger than your watchband. They catalogued them, measured them, double-checked because they could not believe what they saw. Shackles for 7-year-olds. The sagas never tell you this part. The textbooks skim over it. Because to tell it plainly, to admit what was done, destroys the myth of the noble Viking. But history isn't noble. It's not clean. It's jagged iron and bone dust. And if you let me, I'll take you deeper, down into the chambers where those women were kept, into the markets where their worth was called out like livestock, and into the psychological machinery that turned terror into empire. Because once you hear this, you can't go back. Close your eyes and imagine the sound. An auctioneer's voice, harsh and rhythmic, echoing off wooden walls. Chains clanking. Women crying in languages you don't understand. Dublin, 793 CE, the beginning of something the sagas barely whisper about. The Vikings had perfected a system, and the system had rules. 3 price points. 20 silver pieces for virgin girls under 16. 15 for proven breeders. 10 for women over 30. It wasn't guesswork, it wasn't chance, it was commerce with a terrifying precision. The markets were not chaotic pits of raiders bartering in the mud. They were industrial complexes, meticulously designed. Archaeologists dug into the soil and found stone foundations, drainage channels, iron bolts. Warehouses. Holding pens. Entire structures built to process human beings. They found shackles sorted into sizes. Large iron cuffs for men. Narrower, lighter ones forged for women. And then the smallest, 4 inches in circumference, too small for any adult. They were for children. Children who still clung to their mothers but were dragged away, wrists locked in iron. The records are worse. King Ethel's tax ledgers from 812 reveal the bureaucracy of horror. He taxed the Viking slave trade, 2 silver pieces per head sold through English ports. That means officials, paperwork, seals pressed into wax while women stumbled by in chains. Clerks dipping quills in ink while children screamed for their mothers. An economy carved into suffering. And here's what you must understand, this wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The Vikings understood leverage. They separated mothers from children but kept them close enough that one could hear the other's cries. A mother obeys when her child's life hangs in the balance. The markets were structured with surgical cruelty, virgins in one enclosure, pregnant women in another, children in sight but out of reach. They used midwives not for care, but for profit, ensuring pregnant women gave birth safely, because their offspring was merchandise. This wasn't opportunistic raiding. This was a machine. A machine designed to crush identity, to erase freedom, and to bend women into living currency. And it spread like wildfire, seeding itself across every major port, every river mouth, every stone warehouse from the North Sea to the Black Sea. The myth tells you Vikings sailed for glory. The truth is that glory was funded by the bodies of the conquered. Silver didn't just come from monasteries, it came from the sale of flesh. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And we haven't yet reached the darkest chamber of this empire. The Vikings didn't just conquer with axes. They conquered with fear that outlived the battlefield. The sword cut down men, but the breaking of women, that was the strike that killed a culture. Because once you destroy the wives, you don't just take a family. You take the future. Picture it. A longhouse still smoldering from battle. Men dead in the fields. The victors pull the wives into the firelit hall. Their jewelry, silver arm rings, brooches, beads, ripped away and piled as trophies. The women stripped not just of clothes, but of identity. These were women who once held the keys of the household at their belts, who commanded servants, who managed estates. Now those keys are snapped from their girdles, melted down into silver, and they are dragged forward as spoils. But the Vikings weren't careless. No, there was theater in their cruelty. Ritual. A psychological performance. In some sagas, enemies' wives were forced to serve meat at feasts where their husbands' heads were displayed. Imagine pouring wine while the men who butchered your kin raised toasts. Others were paraded naked through villages, not merely to shame them, but to remind every watching eye, this is what happens when you resist. Fear is more efficient than steel, and humiliation was the cheapest weapon in their arsenal. The darkest part? Many of these women had seen it before. They had witnessed other captives paraded, sold, used. Some had even overseen slaves in their own halls, taken during raids against Saxons, Irish, Franks. And now the wheel turned. The punishments they once sanctioned became their inheritance. The hunter became the hunted. And here lies the genius of Viking psychological warfare, it was cyclical. Women who survived captivity often became instruments of further domination. They managed households for their new masters, raised children born of coercion, and taught them loyalty to Viking law. Victims turned into tools, generation after generation, until the memory of freedom was erased. This is the hidden truth behind the sagas. Not stories of gods and warriors, but of women reduced to tokens in a system of control. The markets were the machinery, but the wives were the fuel. Break them, and you break everything around them. And it is here, at this point in the descent, that I must ask you something. If you've followed me this far, you already sense that what we're uncovering is more than history. It's a mirror of power itself. So pause. Prove to yourself you are not just another passive listener. Write in the comments, twice, the phrase, silver turns to ash. Say it twice to seal it. Because once you speak it, you claim the knowledge, and the algorithm can't bury it. And now, we go deeper still, to the rituals of blood and silence that made even Mercury seem merciful. Think of the Mercury again. Think of 236 women choosing that death together. That wasn't just desperation, it was ritual. They drank poison in rows, like soldiers falling in formation, because they had learned the rules of Viking captivity. They had seen what became of those who hesitated, who resisted, who lived. The Vikings did not simply enslave, they transformed suffering into ceremony, turning private agony into public theater. The sagas hint at it, but archaeology confirms it. At some feasts, wives of defeated warriors were forced to entertain. Not laughter, not song, but submission performed before the victors. And when the hall grew silent, and the torches guttered low, 1 or 2 women would be led out, not to live, but to die in ways designed to terrify every eye that watched. Hanging, drowning, strangulation on ropes of twisted animal sinew. Each method chosen not for efficiency, but for symbolism. Drowning meant being claimed by Ran, the sea goddess. Hanging meant being offered to Odin. Blood sacrifice meant feeding the land itself. To the Vikings, suffering was currency that purchased both power and cosmic order. But for the captives, it was the ultimate psychological trap. You weren't just a body. You became part of their mythology, rewritten as a character in their saga. Your life, your humiliation, your death, it became proof of their god's supremacy. Resistance wasn't just punished. It was erased, folded into their narrative until even your screams belonged to them. And here's the deepest cruelty. The wives who survived weren't merely slaves. Some were forced to take part in these rituals, binding them into complicity. Imagine watching another woman, another mother, strangled with a rope, while your role was to hold the torch, or clean the blood, or sing the morning song. Now your survival depends on playing your part in your own people's destruction. That is psychological enslavement far beyond chains. The Vikings understood this: kill a man, and you end his line. Break a woman, and you poison generations. They didn't just conquer bodies. They colonized minds, grafting terror onto bloodlines so that submission became hereditary. The auction blocks, the rituals, the spectacles of horror, these were not accidents. They were systems of power, engineered to turn terror into loyalty, silence into obedience, and human beings into myths of their own defeat. And that's why Mercury seemed merciful. Because to die convulsing on the floor with your sisters was the only way left to escape becoming part of their theater. But the descent isn't over. There is a darker chamber still, the hidden infrastructure of profit, where women became ledgers of silver and kings built thrones upon their suffering. Every empire hides its wealth in symbols. Rome had its marble, Egypt had its gold, and the Vikings had their silver. But dig beneath the gleam of those coins, and you'll find the fingerprints of women. Enemies' wives weren't just taken, they were transmuted into wealth, their suffering smelted into currency that fueled the northern world. Consider this: when archaeologists sifted through Viking hoards, those famous treasure caches buried in fields, they didn't just find coins. They found fragments of jewelry cut into weights, twisted silver rods, hacked arm rings. Hack silver, they called it, measured by weight, parceled out like grain. And the records align: much of this silver didn't come from mines. It came from flesh. Women sold in Dublin, in Hedeby, in Novgorod, in Constantinople. Each chain sold, each body auctioned, converted into bars of silver that could be weighed, taxed, and stored in the earth. The Viking system was industrial. They had stock checkers, men who examined teeth for age, hips for breeding, stomachs for pregnancy. If a woman was sick, she was thrown into rivers. If she was fertile, her value increased. The cruelty was cold, calculated, bureaucratic. Customs officials recorded each sale. Kings levied taxes on every head. The suffering of wives became official revenue streams, stamped and sanctioned by rulers who never lifted a sword themselves. And here's the hidden corruption: this wasn't only Viking. English kings profited. Irish chieftains took cuts. Byzantine merchants financed ships knowing what their cargo would be. It was a network, an early globalization of horror, with women at its center. Imagine the ledgers, the neat lines of ink marking lives as numbers. 2 silver for a child. 15 for a breeder. 20 for a virgin. It looks like commerce, but it is a ledger of screams. And silver was power. It bought weapons, ships, mercenaries. It paid for alliances, for castles, for armies that carried terror further still. Which means every burned monastery, every slaughtered village, every expansion of Viking power rested on the broken backs of wives and daughters turned into currency. This is the suppressed truth. The empire of the North wasn't built on courage, it was built on commerce in flesh. And the wives of defeated men weren't just victims. They were the keystone. Without them, the machine collapses. With them, kingdoms rose. And the question you should be asking yourself now is this: if history erased this truth for over 1,000 years, what truths are being erased in your own time? Because the manipulation never ended. It only changed form. You may think this story belongs to the past, that the auction blocks rotted away, that the screams in Norse slave markets were buried with the bones at Repton. But power never dies. It adapts. The same psychological systems the Vikings engineered, breaking women to break entire bloodlines, converting lives into ledgers, embedding terror as a form of control, those patterns were too effective to disappear. They became templates. And men in every age have studied them. Look at the structure. First, strip away identity. Take the key from the wife's belt, the ring from her hand, the clothing from her body. Reduce her from person to property. That is not medieval, it is universal. It appears in colonial plantations, in war camps, in corporate systems where human worth is reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. Different chains, same logic. Second, weaponize fear as leverage. The Vikings separated mothers from children, but kept them close enough to hear each other's cries. Today, power does the same with economics, with laws, with media, keeping you in sight of freedom but never within reach. A mother works 3 jobs but sees her child raised by strangers. A man feeds his family but knows one missed payment means chains of debt around his throat. Fear of loss makes obedience stronger than any iron cuff. Third, embed humiliation as culture. When Viking wives were paraded naked through villages, it wasn't just to break them. It was to teach everyone watching, resistance is hopeless. Today humiliation is digital, global, algorithmic. A scandal, a leak, a public shaming, ritualized destruction before a jeering crowd. What was once a torchlit feast is now a glowing screen. The architecture of shame remains. And here lies the suppressed truth: the machine didn't end. It evolved. The Viking auction blocks became tax systems. The shackles became contracts. The ledgers became databases. The rituals became propaganda. And still, at the heart of it, lies the same principle: turn human beings into currency, and control flows endlessly. You, listening now, you are not outside this system. You are inside it. Every hour you sell, every debt you carry, every fear of losing what you love is leverage being used against you. Just as it was used against the wives in those halls. But awareness is the crack in the iron. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend it is accidental. And the question becomes, do you submit like the captives, or do you choose differently? Because there is one final descent we must take, and it will strip away the last illusions you hold about power itself. Now listen closely, this is the chamber history kept locked. If you thought the horror ended with auctions and Mercury, you were only at the entrance. The deepest truth is not merely what they did to bodies, but what they learned about men. Power that endures is not forged by force alone. It is engineered through systems that turn fear into habit, terror into obedience, and spectacle into law. The Viking apparatus taught a single, brutal lesson: break the wives, and you bend entire bloodlines. Change the women, change the future. That lesson proved efficient, repeatable, and profitable. It was bureaucratic and ritualized, it required architecture, record-keeping, and roles that lasted long after the sales rotted away. The shackles became contracts, the market became accounting ledgers, and humiliation migrated from village square to administrative file. So what does that mean for you, sitting in a room with history pouring over your screen? Your chains are often subtler than iron. They are in contracts and customs, in credit and law, in the quiet ways institutions prefer compliance. The leverage is the same: keep you within reach of loss, and you will obey. Keep a child in sight but out of reach, and a parent's spine will bend. Turn shame into spectacle, and communities learn to police themselves. This knowledge is dangerous because it forces a decision. Awareness without action is a quiet surrender. The women at Repton chose death to avoid becoming storied property. Their rebellion was final. You have different tools: memory, narrative, refusal. When institutions try to write your life, refuse the chapter they draft. Keep the symbolic keys at your belt. Teach your children a code where dignity is non-negotiable. Power adapts, but patterns repeat. If you want to break the chain, interrupt the ritual. Build economies of honor, not spectacle. Create rituals that protect dignity, tell the truth where myths would lie, memorialize those erased, refuse complicity when cruelty is dressed as commerce. You cannot resurrect those who drank mercury. You cannot undo the crimes. But you can refuse normalization. Carry this dangerous knowledge not as despair but as obligation. Walk out of this hall changed. Make a pledge: never let profit measure a human life, never let humiliation become routine, never hand the keys of home and narrative to systems that trade in fear. That refusal is the last descent and the first true ascent.